Welcome, everyone, to Stats and Scheme with Tage and Shawn. I'm Tage Seth, and today we are going to be talking about three interesting stats and scheme points from week 3 of the NFL season. Shawn, what do you want to talk about first?
Let's check in with three of the AFC South offenses. Of course, in the offseason, I think a lot of people expected the Jaguars, Trevor Lawrence, to continue his growth as a really, really strong quarterback. We have the Texans, which with a whole new coaching staff, CJ Stroud coming in there, and then the Colts with Anthony Richardson and Shane Steichen. So I'll let you go first on terms of whichever team you want to pick of those three. Of course, sorry to Titans fans, but why don't you give me some stats on one of those three teams?
Mhm. I'm glad that we're talking about the AFC South today. I think all these young quarterbacks that of the teams that you mentioned are going to be really interesting. And I do want to start with the Houston Texans, right? Like I think a lot of what they have going on in their passing game is really exciting right now. CJ Stroud currently ranks 13th out of 34 qualifying quarterbacks in passing EPA generated so far this season. That's the best out of any rookie, which I think is really encouraging for Texans fans. And then you have these receiving options starting to emerge for the Texans. Last week, Nico Collins led the league in total expected points added, generated when targeted. And then this week, it was Tank Dell, who was second in total EPA when targeted. Both of those receivers are currently top 10 in yards per out run. Decent amount of that has happened in garbage time. Like I think that if you apply the garbage time filter, they drop down the list a little bit. But between how Stroud is playing and then these two receiving options that they have on the outside right now, I think Texans fans have to be pretty pumped about what's happening to their passing game.
The most important thing for the Texans going into this year was, can we put CJ Stroud in positions to succeed? Are we going to get the offensive coordinator quarterback marriage correct? And it seems like so far, to me, the signs are absolutely positive. With offensive coordinator Bobby Slovic, of course, he was Kyle Shanahan's passing coordinator previously, and the Texans offense, they take from that scheme. I know you love talking about personnel diversity, but it looks like they are personnel diverse. They'll get into 21 personnel. They will force defense into those one high base looks with only 4 defensive backs on the field. And that causes a lot of issues for the defense if they're forced to play more cover 3, because a lot of the passing concepts on offense, they're made easier when they're only playing against one high safety. So that is something that I've liked. And just every week on film, I think I texted you last week about just being encouraged by CJ Stroud. That continues and continues. And, it's to be seen if people think, oh, maybe there's a rookie slump coming. But everything I've seen so far, it shows someone that has extreme anticipation, which I don't think that's always something that you can teach. He has calm feet. He's going through the process well. He isn't panicked by pressure, which I think that is a huge thing for quarterbacks that are younger, especially when maybe you have a hole or two in your offensive line. Once your eyes start going down, that just speeds up your process. It can force errant throws and other things. And I do like how the Texans have used Robert Woods out of the backfield running those choice routes. And it seems like they have built-in yards after catch opportunities for Tank Dell and Nico Collins. And what I like this week, Stroud wasn't afraid to throw that deep ball against one busted coverage and one really just kind of in your face, we're going to throw this over the top of you throw.
Mm-hmm. Right. And like you mentioned, the offensive line, like they have the 20th highest snaps from their starting offensive line. I believe they were playing 3 or 4 backup offensive linemen last week in their wins. So like I think that's really interesting to account for, is like they're still able to create a relatively efficient passing offense from that. And then you also brought up the personnel diversity. They have run 4 different personnels at least 5% of the time this season, which when we talked about this last season, there were 8 teams that were above 4 personnels or greater on at least 5% of the time. So they were doing that really well. And what's really interesting about them is Bobby Slovic is passing more out of 11 personnel than league average, but running more out of 21, 12, and 22 personnel than league average. So when he has his 4 receivers out on the field, he's passing more than the average team does, which I think is really good, because that's when you want to do it. And then when you has his heavier personnel on the field, your 2 tight ends, your 2 running backs, like that's why they made a signing in the offseason to get a second running back in there to complement Dameon Pierce. Like you can start to see that come to form here where he's running a lot more out of those offenses. So I think the Texans offense is really interesting. Is there another one in the AFC South you'd want to move on to next?
Yeah, let's go to the Jaguars, because the Jaguars, it's a story, I think, of film versus stats in a few different ways. When I turn on the Jaguars film, the first thing I see is Trevor Lawrence. I'm not even sure if he has a high ceiling, because it seems like he doesn't have a ceiling. There are throws that he makes that other players, they just cannot get there. He has accuracy on the move that is special. And to my eyes, the offense has been able to move the ball, even if I think it's fair to ding Lawrence on some of those interceptions. But the problems that I have seen, it makes me want to pull my hair out because the offense looks good at times. A ball will be in a perfect spot. It'll hit a receiver in the hands and it'll be a drop. Or the offense starts to get things clicking and it's a nice throw, catch, fumble. I've seen running backs tripping. They had the blocked field goal. Obviously, the special teams errors I wouldn't put on the offense, but it just seems like a team where, to me, I think they're just going to be fine. If the end zone was 11 yards deep 2 weeks or last week, then they would have had like 3 more touchdowns. So to me, a lot of those things are in place. And I guess it may be just me hoping that there are things that are unsustainable between drops and tip balls and fumbles. So what do some of the numbers say on that?
It's a lot of what you brought up there, right? Like they're currently 10th in success rate, which is the rate at which you're generating positive EPA plays. So it's a binary 1 or 0. It can't be influenced by long right or left tail things like turnovers, pick sixes, fumbles, and even like the other side of that where it's like long 40-yard touchdowns. It's just how often are you staying ahead of the chains when you're on offense? So they rank 10th in that. Top 10 is really good. They were a little bit higher than that last year, but that's okay as they still figure out their offense. But they rank 28th in EPA per play right now because so many of those turnovers and fluky things are happening to them, which I think is really interesting. They've lost the 8th most EPA on turnovers this season. And so when you kind of look at the Jaguars offense, something has to break, right? Like it seems like it's an unsustainable amount of turnovers and bad luck that they're having on offense. And then not even mentioning the special teams errors that they've made in the past couple of weeks. I think that with what they have in the receiving game right now, Evan Ingram, Christian Kirk, Zay Jones, Calvin Ridley, and then not to mention Travis Etienne has gotten 13 targets this year. Like I think all 5 of those guys are going to end up showing like how talented they are. And then when you look at Trevor Lawrence specifically, the guy who's throwing them the ball, Ben Baldwin put out this chart about charted measures of quarterback play versus production-based measures of quarterback play. Trevor Lawrence is in the bottom right corner when you look at the charted quarterback play on the x-axis and then the actual production on the y-axis, meaning that he is playing a lot better than his stats show, right? Like on the other side of that is a quarterback like Brock Purdy or Jordan Love, where the scheme and some good luck has been helping them. But Trevor Lawrence has been the other way around, where it's just been a lot of bad luck for them, some unfortunate fumbles and tipped interceptions. So you would bet on his actual charted production staying ahead of the production-based measures like as we go throughout the season.
So I want to talk about 2 different kind of teams that can happen, right? So you can be a high success rate team that has a low EPA. I think the Jaguars may be an example of that, where I think they're around like 10 in success rate, if you told me right. And then the Packers, I think they're kind of the opposite in that, where they're a high EPA team and a low success rate team. So to me, it seems like the Jaguars, they're moving the ball fine, but that lower EPA comes from splash negative plays, right? Like interceptions and fumbles and things like that. And then the Packers on the opposite end, I mean, to my eyes, I think they've been okay, but if maybe they're not moving the ball the same way, but they have those big plays. So are those kind of correct characterizations of the different ends of if you're high or low on one of success rate versus EPA?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah, that's a great way to put it. I believe the Packers are currently 19th in success rate, but 3rd in EPA per play. So, if you were betting on one offense for the rest of the season, I think you'd feel slightly more comfortable with the Jaguars just because of the sustainable stuff that they're doing, like the success rate, like staying ahead of the chains. And when I've looked at this in the past, explosive play rate is more predictive than negative play rate for the rest of the season, because you think about who controls explosive play rate. That's usually the quarterback to wide receiver 1 connection. Like when we think about the majority of explosive plays in the last couple of years in the NFL, you think about Aaron Rodgers to Devontae Adams, Patrick Mahomes to Travis Kelce or Tyreek Hill, and so Jalen Hurts to AJ Brown and Devontae Smith last year. But negative plays are fluky things. That could be your backup running back coming in and fumbling at the goal line, and that being a -7 EPA swing depending on where the defense recovers it. You're thinking about tipped interceptions. Like we've seen so many of that. So that's why, like, when you can bet on the success rate, the explosive play rate of these teams going forward, I'm not super worried about the Jaguars. Like, I think if they were in a different division, maybe where they're already like 2 games back, like I think that would be time to press the panic button. But since they have still these other offenses figuring out their young quarterback situations, I think the Jaguars will be fine.
Do you have a preference of if we cut things into kind of chunks of the season, or just go by week by week, in terms of, should we look at EPA just for this week, or should we look at it as a collective, kind of a total EPA? I'm just trying to think. I feel like on a few of our charts that Sumer Sports put out, you see Trevor at the bottom, and sometimes it's just a hard road to climb uphill because he had those throw it off someone's face mask and it ends up as an interception. And it, of course, is attributed to the quarterback. So do you have a preference of, is success rate something we should take over multiple weeks, but EPA over maybe 1 or 2 weeks? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point to bring up. And Robbie Greer and Timo Riske have done like good research on this before. And like, I think it's always best to ensemble metrics together. When you can use EPA per play and success rate, you can look at it on the same graph, or look at it on sumersports.com where they're right next to each other. You can really think about like, all right, like which offenses are pretty linear with how their EPA compares to success rate. You think about like the Dolphins offense that we'll get into, for example, like are very high in both of those metrics. Then you think about these other offenses where you can expect some of that EPA per play to stay the same, but you know that if it's wildly different than their success rate rank, it should come back to the middle eventually. So it's kind of on a case-by-case basis right now. But as we go out throughout the season, the EPA per play will start to become, the distribution of it will start to shrink. And then the success rate distribution will shrink at a lesser rate also.
I think that makes sense. And then for our last AFC South offense, I think it's more of a projection, but being the Colts from week 1 and week 2, I think Anthony Richardson is ahead of where people expected him on his development curve. Really poised in the pocket. He can get through his reads with comfort, arm strength just to make up for things. And him being tied to Shane Steichen, I feel so lucky that hopefully we get to see Anthony Richardson come back healthy and be able to see them together. The quarterback run game designs that we saw in week 1 and week 2 were just great. And I think a quarterback that can move around like that, it makes linebackers' life harder. It slows them down a tick. And I think that this is going to be a team next year that I hope that they're just absolutely elite in the red zone, because you can't cover everything. You can't cover Anthony Richardson on counter while also guarding the guy in the flat, while also guarding maybe a receiver leaking out. It's similar to the Eagles offense last year. Of course, Shane Steichen, I'm sure, brings over a majority of that. And that was a fun one. I know that maybe we don't have as many metrics on the Colts. And as I said, it's a little bit more of a projection. But what do you have from the Colts so far?
I think you nailed it with the Shane Steichen stuff. I think for the Colts to go into Baltimore with their backup quarterback and win in that sloggy game as 9.5 point underdogs is really something like that, is encouraging for Colts fans to see that their head coach was able to do that. Richardson and Minshew, they rank 22nd and 23rd in EPA per play right now. So the offense isn't necessarily producing differently with either quarterback. When Richardson is healthy, like I assume and I hope that the Colts will go back to starting him. Like, I think the worst thing that you could do is start Gardner Minshew because you're 2-1 and you like think you have a chance at the playoffs. Even if you do have that, I think that the Colts, the whole goal of this season is to find out what Richardson is. We've already seen that he has that running ability, that pressure to sack rate being really low in college has already carried over to the NFL, which I think is exciting for Colts fans as well. And so now it's about all the other stuff. Like he's shown decent connection with Michael Pittman. How does he do with secondary receivers? He's shown that he's been able to make some pretty good reads, but what about if you put more on his plate? Like, I think the Colts should be just finding out his strengths and weaknesses so that they know how to build around him going into next season, like you mentioned.
And I really do like Shane Steichen. I think he's going to be able to hit easy buttons. I do think he's going to be an aggressive head coach, as Nick Sirianni was in Philadelphia. Of course, he was under him last year. There was a funny moment in the game where the Colts put out their field goal unit on 4th down, immediately switch out, put their offense back onto the field. And then by rule, the referee is going to go over the ball and hold it because the defense has the right to sub to match that. And so you see the Ravens guy subbing in, and he is taking his jolly good time and strolling, really to force a delay a game, because by rule, he's allowed to sub in. So that was a funny one where I think they cut to Steichen and he's kind of laughing at the other sideline, like a good move. So I'm happy to see Steichen going forward. I think he's going to be a good one. And that game was pretty fun. Of course, shout out Mike McDonald. He had Kyle Hamilton coming off the edge. He had 3 sacks. So that'll be a good matchup. Hopefully we get to see more of those matchups going forward.
Yeah, for sure. And like the Ravens are just so injured right now. Like if you look at their injury report, it's like longer than a CVS receipt. So I think that's what kind of led to the game being as close as it was going into overtime, where both teams each had 2 possessions in overtime and went punt, turnover on downs. Colts ended up making the field goal. With Matt Gay, they're winning the game for them. It showed up as the second most exciting game in our excitement index behind Vikings Chargers. So I think it was a really fun game. And now the Ravens have to probably grind a little bit more than they thought in the division as they like saw an opportunity with other teams struggling. But let's move on to our second topic of the day. We just talked about AFC South. Now we want to talk about historic starts. So there's 2 historic starts, one on each side of the ball happening right now. I want to kick it off with Dolphins offense. Shawn, what are some of your thoughts on how this Dolphins offense is playing so far?
My first thought is you need to press the no receipt button at CVS. That's a trap. Just let's save some paper here. But now we're building a CVS receipt of how many times I'm going to talk about the Dolphins. I wish everyone could see our text. The first thing when we think about the notes, really no matter what happens, like, hey, Tej, I want to talk about the Dolphins offense again. And I get a little nervous. Are you going to cut me off after 3 weeks? I'm sure we're going to talk about them again next week after Bills Dolphins. But in week 1, the Dolphins brought us that fast out motion to get to those deeper passing concepts. In week 2, they used that same motion to open up space in the quick game. And week 3, to me, was all about how Mike McDaniel used that motion and formation variation in the run game. They ran so many variations of crack toss, which very basically you have a receiver or usually a tight end. They block down on the end player of the line of scrimmage. Usually a tackle will pull out into space, but a few times they would have their tackle kind of sprint forward, up and out, and get to the linebacker really quick with a fullback or a motion player who would end up blocking out that space player. That was something I saw a lot from the 49ers last year as a way to get Trent Williams into space, which that's always a good thing if you're on offense. So their different run variations are so scary because you need to honor the most explosive passing offense in the league. That same out motion, it can bump players out and let receivers have better angles. And McDaniels is finding great ways to manipulate the box. It feels unfair that we allowed him to have Devin Achane. And then I'm just so glad every time I see Raheem Mostert run the ball. I think he's a testament to kind of miles per hour metrics, sometimes over just 40 metrics. And they did that all without Jalen Waddle. So that's what it seems like Mike McDaniel like studied the wing tee and really he's running these things where 2 is spinning around in circles where you would see it from a high schooler and 8th grade quarterback in the wing tee because it is so difficult to stop at lower levels. And when you supercharge it with what they have, it's just so many things put together where CBS receipt, I think, is what I do want to compare it to because you can just look at the whole entire list and it's thinking, okay, we can't stop Tyreek Hill on a deep ball, so we have to back off, but they want to get the ball on the edge, so we need our cornerbacks to be able to tackle. And it's just one by one. They can manipulate your linebackers. And Tua is playing at a really high level right now. So wherever, maybe if something was to go wrong right now, Tua is getting you a second read. He is able to be more comfortable in the pocket. He's throwing outbreakers across to the other side from the other hash. And that's scary. I just think it's scary for defenses.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I mean, I think you summarized so much of what's making this Dolphins offense not only great, but like actually an historic start from them right now. Through the first 3 weeks of the season, we have data back all the way through 1999. They have the best offense in terms of EPA per play of any offense ever going back to that year. You look at this list that they're on. The 2018 Chiefs, Patrick Mahomes' first year, amazing offense. The Packers 2020 season, like very, very good offense. The Ravens 2019 offense, awesome offense to watch with Lamar winning the MVP that year. And then like the teams that are kind of considered like to have the best offenses of all time, the Patriots in 2007, the Falcons in 2016, which was my favorite offense of all time to watch. So like the Dolphins are ahead of all of these teams so far when just looking at the first 3 weeks of the season, because they can just do so many different things. Like you mentioned, like 11 personnel was their death lineup this year. Like it was unstoppable by defenses. They had the best EPA per pass, second best EPA per rush out of 11 personnel this season. And then they didn't have Jalen Waddle in this game, like you mentioned. And so they had to run 21 personnel on 42% of snaps. and it was their best performing personnel of the day by far. You think about all those clips of Raheem Mostert like lead blocking for Devin A-Chain, having both of them out on the field, just using them in motion. Like they were missing their second best receiving option and arguably like a top 15, top 20 receiver in the NFL. And it didn't even matter. Like they scored 70 points on the Dolphins. And so like Tua has had 2 of these 3 weeks now where he has led the league in expected points added on that specific week. So like the ceiling and the floor of this offense are just incredibly high, which I think makes it so fun to watch.
I do wonder, or whenever you see a historic start, especially through, of course, 3 weeks is a small sample size, though I think football is a relatively small sample size sport. You wonder, well, is it sustainable? To me, it is, because they've shown not 3 different offenses in the first 3 weeks, but they've really been able to win 3 different ways. And first, I think it's a testament actually to how well Bill Belichick and the Patriots played, where I thought they did have some success on the defensive end, where teams are not going to be able to replicate that on defense because they don't have the same personnel, particularly, and the flexibility from the defensive personnel. But I feel like they're not going to score 70 points every single week. But I think it's sustainable because it's different ways of winning. We can beat you deep. We can beat you underneath if you're too afraid of us going deep. And if you're going to try and just sit on the quick game, we can run the ball at you too. So it's an unenviable task. I do want to ask you, I think they were up, they had 70 points and then they had the option on a 4th down to kick a field goal. Would you have kicked that field goal, Tish?
Yeah, I'm petty like that. I definitely would have gone for the record there, or tying the record. But Mike McDaniel's a better man than I am. I like all like the talk about how he was a Broncos ball boy, grew up a Broncos fan. They didn't interview him. Like this was kind of like him taking out like everything he had on the team that didn't interview him for head coach right now, which is pretty funny. But yeah, would you have kicked the field goal?
No, I wouldn't have. I thought about it for a bit, but I'm glad that Mike McDaniel didn't. If it was a Madden game with my brothers, I 1,000,000% would have. I know I say that with no hesitation, but I'm glad McDaniel did that. I think he does a good job of, seems like a genuine person, and these are all obviously intangible things, but I think he did a good job there of, now that you can reflect it more on, well, this team just had an incredible victory. It's not a conversation of, oh, was McDaniel right or wrong to do this? And I think watching that game, if people were thinking, oh, they really, really ran it up, they had a lot of defensive turnovers. They had a lot of times where they just end up with the ball on the 8-yard line. And it's not like they were running the most complicated pass concepts in the world or running these kind of shot plays. They were killing them on the ground. So that's a testament to the offense for sure. And I think next week we have, I don't know why the Bills Dolphins game next week is at 1 p.m. I'm not a schedule maker. I know you're not a schedule maker. But I know we'll both wake up for that London game, obviously, the Falcons Jaguars. But I'm interested. I don't know if you have any thoughts on the Bills Dolphins matchup. The Bills seem like they're, continuing to get their way. They obviously have just nuclear offensive potential. We're both rooting for a 49-48 game that goes into double overtime or something like that. Or there is no double overtime. What am I saying? But the Bills offense has the ability to maybe not score 70 points, but to match the Dolphins shot for shot if Josh Allen is able to hit some of those plays where you think, well, maybe I wouldn't have thrown that one, but it's getting in there.
Yeah, for sure. And like, I'm so excited for this game. This will be the highest watch score on the watch scores that we put out by far this week. Like I think everyone at 1:00 Eastern will be tuning in for this game. And I think like, yeah, you think about like the journey of the Bills and like the narrative around them this season, where Josh Allen has 4 turnovers on Monday night, nationally televised game. Everyone's watching that. And the perception of Josh Allen and the Bills in general immediately drops, right? They lose to a backup quarterback. They lose to Zach Wilson, and people are already like questioning them. And then since they played the early slate in 2 blowouts the past 2 weeks, they've quietly been the second best team in the NFL these past couple of weeks, behind the Dolphins, of course. And I think the point spread in this game reflects that. Like the market has Bills minus 2.5. If you bake in 1.5 points for home field advantage, that means they think that the Bills are a slightly better team on the neutral field, which I think is fair. And you look at this game where it's like you mentioned, like the Bills have the Josh Allen to Stephon Diggs connection that has really just come alive even more than usual the past couple of weeks, that can compete with what the Dolphins do on offense. And then Gabe Davis has really come along. It's been the year after for his breakout that everyone predicted it to happen in. But like, I think that that's starting to happen as well. So the Bills can start to feel more comfortable about having to not either feed Diggs or Josh Allen design run. Like when you get Gabe Davis going, maybe Dalton Kincaid starts going a little bit more than he has been already. Like, I think that's where some of these scenarios for the Bills to win the game without doing the same formula over and over start to formulate.
I think if you maybe don't look at the film or don't see it, you may think, oh, the Bills offense is able to have more success because Josh Allen is playing safer. And to me, that's not what it is. And I don't think you need to look at it like that. Of course, you don't want him to make throws that are right to defenders, but he has just rocket ship potential. So you don't want to curb that in too many ways. You want to maybe make him make more calculated risk, or he still should be rolling out and throwing those deep balls, because I think there was one crazy one earlier to Diggs where you're looking at the defense and all right, things are covered up. The rush is starting to get to him. And if he's able to escape and make those throws, it's so unguardable on defense. But on the opposite end, the Bills defense, they had a ton of sacks against Washington, against Sam Howell, where some of those are coverage sacks. Some of those are defensive line wins. They will blitz you. It seems like Sean McDermott is a little bit more happy to blitz than teams in past seasons. But it seems like to match up against the Dolphins, you need to have your like custom NCAA 2014 recruiting class that you sim 3 years and then you just get 99 overalls at every position, because I do not know what any team is going to do. I feel like we're going to talk about it until it happens. And then when it happens, we'll talk about it. But again, to me, the important thing is the Dolphins can win in so many different ways that you just want to compete on offense, and hopefully your offense is able to blow the doors off them and you can win that way.
Exactly. I think it's like a Chip Kelly Oregon team where you're not going to be able to stop the offense. So you're just going to have to hope to take advantage of the defense and hope for fluke turnovers. Like I haven't seen an answer yet to the Dolphins offense, because Mike McDaniel seems like he spent the whole offseason thinking of all the answers that people gave last year, and then also anticipating like what people might have to question it. Like you think about the Dolphins offense, like the main complaint about it was like they don't run that well. They don't run the ball enough. Like it's too much pressure on the passing game. They're passing too much. And like some of that was probably fair last year, but now that they're running the ball efficiently and they're doing it enough where they can just like take over these games and just run the ball and stay ahead of the chains because of that. Like I think that causes a big problem for the Bills defense, which will make this game really interesting. I think everyone should be really excited for it. Let's move on to the other historic start here before we get on to our third topic, which is the Browns defense. So Browns defense, again, like actually starting historically great when you look at all the stats. They've had the lowest success rate of any defense through the first 3 weeks of the season. Caveats about some of the offenses they were playing: Bengals, Joe Burrow injured in a very rainy game. And then they went to play the Steelers, who currently have the lowest ranked offense in the league from an EPA per play standpoint. And then the Titans, who are kind of struggling to find their identity right now. But like, I think that you still have to mention the Browns as being a very, very good defense right now, even if it might regress. Like I think everything that they're doing and everything that Jim Schwartz has brought in from a scheme perspective, and then also like the defensive linemen that they brought in to complement Myles Garrett playing at a defensive player of the year level right now, is super exciting for Browns fans. What has the film shown for you from what the Browns defense is doing?
The Browns make life so hard on quarterbacks, and there are different ways to bother a quarterback. It can be just your pass rush winning. It can be covering all the routes really well. It can be blitzing and rotating on defense. And the Browns under Jim Schwartz, they have all of that clicking. Of course, it starts with Myles Garrett, because if you're coming up with an offensive game plan, you need to be conscious of where he is on every single snap. There were some quick throws last week that I was watching, and no defensive end has any business causing pressure on that, because everything should be happening so quick. And it's not that the quarterback was late, but still Myles Garrett is able to get in the quarterback's face from the edge. And then when you have Zadarius Smith there also, I think, playing pretty well, you can't just triple team Garrett and expect to win everywhere else. And I love that we saw Garrett over the center a few times in week 1, and now Smith and Garrett on the same side. That's a really fun way to do it, where they have Okoronkwo on the other side who can also win. So I just can't picture offensive lines going in feeling really happy about it. They get tackles for losses on the backside of runs. It seems like they don't allow a lot of yards after the catch. They will contest routes and get in receivers' faces, but then can also play some of those not softer, but they may look softer, those too high looks without having to stuff the box. I wish that we got to see the Browns defense versus the Dolphins offense at this point. And it seems to me, I'm not sure if you agree, offensive historic starts, they can maybe be sustained in some different ways, whereas defense, it may not be as sustainable, or that maybe just be what the common view is on offensive defense. Why don't you talk about that for a little bit in terms of generally what we see as sustainable between offensive performance and defensive performance?
For sure. Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up. I view defensive stats as being more descriptive than predictive. I think that when you're looking backwards and you're saying like, all right, which defenses have performed well, you can look at all these defensive stats, success rate, EPA per play, whatever. And like, that's what we've been looking at for the Browns. EPA is also a pretty descriptive stat for offenses, but like it's very predictive. Like when I read that list of the top 10 offenses in the first 3 weeks of the season, all of those offenses were basically considered the best offense in the league by the end of that season. So you can already kind of tell that right away. But I wouldn't be shocked if the Browns defenses finishes the season number one in whatever metric you want to look at, DVOA, success rate, EPA per play, because they're so talented. They are playing with this fire. Like, it's really fun to watch their DBs like celebrate after incompletions. Like, I think that was something that wasn't there last year, which I know is not analytical, but like there's a real impact that's happening there. But like the thing that you mentioned with like the Darius Smith and all the other defensive linemen that they added in is it's not like the game plan can't be run away from Myles Garrett, move the pocket away from Myles Garrett now, because there's just so many other guys that can beat you along the defensive line. And I think that's what's really exciting for this Browns defense is as long as they stay healthy, like they should be able to just keep churning out these strong defensive line performances where they're not allowing anyone to the red zone. They've only played 9 snaps of defense in the red zone this season. The next closest is the Cowboys at 22. And then I think the craziest stat is they've allowed less touchdowns this year than their offense has, right? Like they've only allowed 1 touchdown the entire season. And it was a long George Pickens touchdown. And the offense has given up 2 touchdowns on 2 turnovers against the Steelers. So I think that like when you look at the Browns defense, I hope the offense can keep up, and because this defense deserves to be in the playoffs. And I think they have a really exciting matchup against the Ravens this week, which should be fun to watch as well.
I'm glad we got the hard-hitting analysis of defensive back celebrations. I know we don't track that at Sumer Sports, or at least I don't think we do yet. But I know people clown on on cornerbacks. Like if it's a wide overthrow and the cornerbacks celebrate, look, give those guys some slack. It's obviously a very, very emotional game. It's so hard to play defensive back in the NFL. The rules are against you. The fans probably are against you. They want to see more points. Tej, I'm sure that your graphs are all against them because you want to see receivers get open and everything. So I'm never going to clown a defensive back. It always feels awful when they do that seatbelt celebration and then they turn around and see the flag. I feel bad for those situations. But, I always, whenever there's a replay of pass interference, I'm always like, just give the defensive back some slack on those.
Right. I totally agree. I think behind quarterback, defensive back is the toughest position to play in the NFL. And it's like you have to have a certain mentality to play it. Like you have to have short-term memory. Because like if you have one of those pass interference plays, like you have to pop up, guard the same receiver that you're guarding. Like you have to guard Justin Jefferson or Devontae Adams or Tyreek Hill again on the next play after like maybe just getting burned by them. And like you just have to like just think about like yourself defending the pass successfully, because if not, like it would get really hard mentally for these defensive backs. So it's always nice to see them celebrate and get some credit when they're playing well. And like I think that when you look at the Browns defense right now, like they're all just kind of like in sync, the way that they're moving together, and all the stats back that up. So I think that's going to be something really fun to watch the rest of the year.
I think one of the ways that offenses try to take advantage of defenses is most defenses don't have 11 all-stars, right? You're trying to find, maybe you got a weak point here, a weak point there. And one of the ways that offenses can do that or try to do that is through empty sets, which is going to be our third topic. And empty sets, it's just offensive formations with no players in the backfield. Usually it's from shotgun, generally 3 players to one side and 2 players to the other side, but you can also have a 4x1 set. And empty can simplify things a bit because defenses, they aren't able to disguise their blitzes in the same way just because of the distance from, we're going to pretend like we're over a receiver, but blitz over that. But because they're spread out further, it's just harder to do that. And then their coverage can also sometimes be simplified because defenses usually have kind of a set menu of these are our empty checks. Offenses can put their running back out wide to see if the defense matches with the linebacker, which is more of a hint towards man coverage. Or if they have a cornerback on a running back, that kind of gives you a little bit more of a hint for zone coverage. But recently, I think teams have done a little bit better job of maybe playing cover 2 with a linebacker out there. And offense, they want to get you in one-on-one matchups where they figure out different ways. Maybe it's their best receiver is the innermost player on that through receiver side, because a lot of split safety coverages, they're drawn up, and it ends up with that linebacker not manned up on that third receiver, but it ends up in a matchup there where on the offensive side, a lot of times you're going to take that matchup every time. So Tej, I know empty, it seems like it isn't used so much that we have this great sample size, but why don't you tell us a little bit about what you pulled on empty?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that was a great description of like the benefits that empty can give. And so far this season, empty is doing really well relative to how it's done seasons before, as well as like just in general. Currently, like this season, since offense has been down a little bit, the median pass play in general has had about a 0 flat EPA, which has been really interesting. Usually it's slightly above that because of passing being more efficient than running. But right now, like the median empty play is a 0.1 EPA per play. So like when you look at like if where that would rank across the league, like that would rank about 10th if you just ran empty and had that exact median outcome. And I think like the Buffalo Bills, for example, that we talked about earlier, like they were the best team out of empty last season. They ran it about 12% of the time and for 0.36 EPA per play, which was the best mark in the league. We're still working with small sample sizes this season, but so far the 49ers have ran it 11% of the time. The Dolphins have ran it 11% of the time. And then the Bills are back with 13%. All of those offenses have been really efficient doing it. The 49ers have had a 0.75 EPA per play on their 22 plays out of empty. And I think what's really interesting is like offenses are treating empty as like kind of their way to get deep passes. From what I've noticed in the stats, like the average depth of target from empty has increased from 7.4 average yards through the air in 2020 through 8.4 in 2023. And it's just incrementally jumping each year. So teams are using it as their deep ball. It's the same pattern when you look at early downs as well. So this is not just a third down thing. I think like when you see these teams like the 49ers, the Dolphins, the Bills that are using empty a lot, you can start to see like why they're using it, like what they're getting out of it. And I think that's something that's going to be really intriguing to follow.
And of course, in football, things usually aren't just good or bad in and of themselves because there are downsides to empty. So you're protecting with 5. So the defense is able to pick or stunt you in different ways where they may be able to get after the quarterback. My guess is that the time to throw should probably be a little bit closer or a little bit less because, again, protecting with 5, you have less of a threat in the run game, but you also have to have the ability on the offensive side. Do you have matchups that you feel like you can win one-on-one? Because if you don't have those receiving threats, then it becomes a problem. And this topic, to me, it came right away on Thursday night watching the 49ers because they had 2 awesome examples where they start in 2-back I formation. They have 2 tight ends, and then they motion out to empty. And then one time it was a screen to Christian McCaffrey. The next time they hit Kittle in open space. And using those personnel groupings and having that flexibility, it's so hard for a defense to figure out what personnel do we match it with initially. Then it forces them to communicate again at the line. And just another way that offenses, they make life so hard for defenses. And with the Dolphins, I do wonder how much of it is, look, they're just kind of good at everything. So I don't know what their influence on all the numbers are going to be, where whatever you type in, then it's just Dolphins top right. So teams, again, I don't feel like they use empty a ton. It's not that I'm prescribing, hey, teams need to be running more empty, but I love it as a change up in different ways, whether it's tempoing from different formations, and particularly that 49ers example where if you are showing a power run look, you're probably going to get that base personnel from the defense. And then if you have the ability to spread out, get Christian McCaffrey in space, get George Kittle breaking against the linebacker or safety, it's such a positive for the offense.
Right, exactly. And like I can't go to any coach in the league and say like, hey, like empty is performing better than other offensive formations on pass plays. Like you guys should just run that 10% of the time. Like you need the right personnel to do that. Like you mentioned, empty is only used on 7% of passing plays in general, which is something that I think is like a testament to like why you just can't do it all the time. And, you think about like, if you're an offense going through your week of game prep, you only have to install, let's say 3 or 4 empty plays. the 49ers only have to install 3 or 4 empty plays, but they've shown, let's say 10 or 11 of them this year, like the one that you mentioned. I'm sure there's been a lot of looks out of that. And so the defense is preparing and watching film for 10 or 11 of them. The 49ers show up with their changeup with just 3 or 4 empty plays in their playbook on their call sheet that they're going to run this year. And they already have that advantage of they didn't have to spend as much time installing those. They've already worked on them in training camp, while since defenses are only seeing this 7% of the time, they're probably not used to a ton of empty looks, and they have to spend the week kind of getting accustomed to that. And that's where I think like the gap can start to come from the game planning standpoint. And when I look at like for example, like the Rams Bengals game from Monday night, like the Rams offensive line was not performing particularly well. And you think about when the Rams offense was best in 2021, the year they won the Super Bowl, where they were getting into empty a ton, and it was 5-7 step drops because they had one of the best offensive lines in the league, and they were able to support all that. Now you shift to this offensive line that is below average from a league standpoint, and like they can't do any of that empty stuff anymore. It has to be a lot more quick release, quick in breaking routes and different stuff like that. So like that's why like the selection bias issue is there for some of the stats with empty, but I still think it's something that has been a good story to follow this year so far.
I'm glad you mentioned the defensive game plan aspecting of it, because defensive game plan, it is time restricted. You don't have 7 months other than, or however many months you have for your first game, but on a week-to-week basis, you have a set amount of time to prepare, and you can't change the entire structure of your defense. You can't rebuild your whole entire roster overnight. And defense in the NFL, it's a lot of the times it is about what you have to do and not about what you want to do. So I think that's a good example that you mentioned, where if they show empty, it's, hey, we need to prepare for it. And we're not going to have 17 empty checks, because it doesn't really make sense to do that when offenses don't have a million empty plays. And I do like how some offenses, they'll have 4 receivers on one side and 1 receiver to the other. And you seem to use it just almost as like pick a side, where depending on where the defense is devoting resources, maybe we'll throw a quick screen to the right side, to the 4 receiver side. But if there's space, we're going to have a backside one-on-one ISO, where maybe a slant, maybe a fade or something like that. But that's a way formationally you've created an isolation. So that is tough for defenses. And then the quarterback run game is something that I think is just continues to increase as we get more of these special quarterbacks that also are comfortable running. And you can motion a guy in where it becomes maybe they're faking a jet sweep before they're running, or you've seen more teams use different versions of quarterback draw where their center is kind of folding to maybe the left side of their left guard and getting up to the linebacker. So just so many things. And I think everyone's life in the NFL is so hard. I was interested when you mentioned whose life you think is hardest in the NFL. All the positions are so hard to play, right? Mm-hmm. If you're a linebacker, you find yourself isolated on Devontae Adams when the Raiders go empty. That's really tough. When you're a left tackle, you got Myles Garrett going after you. That's really tough. And then even on the quarterback side, right? There's all these tools that make things a little bit easier. But I think defenses do a really, really good job of particularly finding ways now, we can always wrap it back to our good friend Mike McDonald, of finding ways to pressure with only sending 4 players. Mm-hmm. So maybe it'll be a topic for a future week, where empty is particularly a set where, because you only have 5 pass rushers, the defense has different ways to understand we can get our linebackers sent free while only rushing 4, which is your simulated pressures or your creeper pressures. But maybe we'll save that one for another week.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I think, I always think back to that Thursday night Ravens-Dolphins game from 2020, 2021, where the Dolphins just crowded the line of scrimmage the whole night with 6-7 guys. The Brian Flores defense, we're already seeing him do a lot of that in Minnesota as well, where it's like no matter what the Ravens did, they tried to go into empty. They tried to go into heavy sets where they were chipping with tight ends and all that stuff. And like there was nothing that they could do for that. And we didn't even mention, actually, speaking of that, is what did you think about the 2 tight ends following Myles Garrett around back and forth wherever he lined up on the play?
Well, look, I would do that too. Like if I said your plan has to be based around him, you can't be agnostic to where he lines up. I think it would be silly to say wherever he lines up, we're going to try and play him one-on-one. It was pretty funny to see the 2 tight ends kind of go like that, but I do not blame the Titans at all, because I think that makes a lot of sense to do that, especially the way that he's able to fluster the passing game in different ways. Now, I do want to see maybe the stats on how many times he's double teamed, how many times he's triple teamed. It seems like he's having one of those Aaron Donald year so far. And I hope he stays healthy, hope it continues, especially because I do think that defense just has the ability to stay special because they have really good players at every level of the defense. It's not just a team where you say, this is the best defensive line, or this might be the best defensive end in the game, but we can cut them up in the pass game. Now, I don't think they're going to be the number one pass defense probably, but having a strong defensive end like that, it makes everyone's life easier, whether it's linebackers in the run game, maybe they're kept clean. Maybe the defensive backs don't have to cover for as long because they know, they trust, they can be a little bit more aggressive, knowing we're probably not going to get that like 2.8 seconds on a drop back because, Myles Garrett's coming and he's going to go ahead and take you down. So it was funny to see that, but I don't blame the offense in any bit. I think it's a testament to that is a special player who is fighting for a defensive player of the year spot.
Right, exactly. And our friend Arjun Menon brought this up to me the other day, but like the Browns went from the third worst run defense in terms of EPA per rush to the second best right now, only behind the Eagles, who you talk about with Rochelle Kapadia every week that everyone should check out, which is a really good listen. So, we appreciate everyone listening to this fourth episode of Stats and Scheme as well. Please keep the feedback coming as we continue the show. I apologize last week. I was traveling, didn't have my mic in normal setup, so my audio was a little bit poor, but hopefully it sounds better this week now that I'm back with home field advantage. But please listen to Eric and Thomas's show on Mondays and Wednesdays, as well as Parker Fleming's show on Thursdays, where he gets some really cool guests. We will see you all next week.